Hello and welcome back to another episode of Sexology Podcast. I am so excited to welcome Dr. Alexandra Solomon to our show. Dr. Alexandra, welcome to our show.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nazanin. Glad to be here with you.
I am very excited about this conversation. I know you have your wonderful podcast, Reimagining Love, and you're a published author. And I was just sharing with you just before we started the conversation, I saw you speak in a conference a few years ago, which was very powerful and moving. So, we're doing a new season on psychology of intimate relationships. That's something that many of our listeners they requested. And I love that in your book, Loving Bravely, you emphasize the importance of relationship between love and sex. Can you tell us more about how these things are they supposed to be hand in hand, or we can have good sex and relationship without loving our partner? What do you think about that?
Yeah. I think perhaps similar to your journey within our field, I'm as a licensed clinical psychologist and somebody who trained extensively in the area of marriage and family therapy. I grew up really with a sense that like the people who are talking about relationships are over here in one side of the world, and the people who are talking about sex are over here in the other side of the world. And I think that split between, those who look at relationships and those who look at sex, probably that exists within our field, probably reflects or mirrors the larger public conversation about we can either talk about love or we can talk about sex. I think that we are all sort of collectively struggling to see how do these two fit together. And I think that they fit together in different ways, for different people at different moments in their relationships. But I know that the way that I was trained as a clinician was that my job as a couples therapist was to help people talk better to each other, talk more nicely to each other, talk more effectively to each other. And then if we did a good enough job with that, the sex would follow. And so even when I was training to be a couples therapist, this was, sex was really put on the back burner. And I think, again, reflecting just how collectively, whatever, ignorant, afraid, confused we are about sex. And the thing that we know from working with couples is that sexual problems don't tend to resolve on their own. And certainly there are ways in which what happens outside of the bedroom affects what happens inside the bedroom, but what happens inside the bedroom then, can kind of like grow and enhance the relationship outside of the bedroom. So I'm really committed to helping us look holistically at intimate partnerships because that is the one of the things that makes an intimate partnership, a marriage or a dating relationship, what sets it apart from friendship and the other relationships that we have is that is the space where we are cultivating our relationship with the erotic. So, and I think there are couples who can love each other very much and struggle mightily around sex. And I think that there are lots of people who could tell us stories about incredible sexual experiences they have with people they don't feel in love with. So certainly they don't have to go hand in hand. But what we know about couples, especially monogamous couples and couples who've been together for a while and who want to be together, is that really they do need to be active and proactive about cultivating their erotic relationships.
I agree with you that definitely seeing couples that are living together for years. They're wonderful roommates, but they don't have the sexual spark. I've seen very few couples in long-term monogamous relationship when the relationship is struggling that they continue to have great sex. It's usually when the things outside the bedroom is not going well. It certainly impact your sexual connection because part of being having great sexual experiences is being vulnerable and open, and when you're feeling hurt and misunderstood, that's hard to do.
Mhm.
And I love that you are kind of looking having this holistic approach because I don't know how you can do a couples therapy without talking about sex and intimacy, or
Mhm.
can do sex therapy and not talk about the relationship.
Yeah.
These things are very connected.
Yeah.
Since you see a lot of different types of people, I bet that you see some similarities in their challenges. What are some of the most common challenges that couples face, the ones that you see in your practice
Mhm.
around sex and intimacy?
Mhm. I do wanna share, you were talking about how it's hard to imagine a couple that is thriving sexually while being problem saturated outside of the bedroom, and I was immediately thinking of a couple that I worked with many, many years ago at this point, and they were steeped in problems. They had so many problems, and in-law problems and parenting problems and financial problems. And I was getting to know them and kind of mapping out all these challenges. And of course, I was asking them about their sexual relationship, and they were like, we make love every day. And I was like, really stumped because I was like, but you've got contempt and you've got and so I was like, can you tell me? I was really hard to even know what the next question would be because I was so struck by this. And I was like, can you just tell me more? And they were confused. They were like, we don't understand. Like, of course we have sex every day. Like, yes, we've got problems, but why would we not be having sex every day? And I was like, okay, this is going to be an interesting therapeutic process because it just stood out in contrast to what happens the vast majority of the time, which is, as you were saying, that if it's difficult to feel safe and vulnerable, and that is not gendered, right? I think that is true for folks, across any gender spectrum that we want to create, that without at least a foundation of safety and vulnerability, it's very hard to feel playful. We can certainly go through the motions and be a bit robotic, but it's really hard to feel present and playful and expressive for sure. I was thinking about so in terms of your question about common challenges, when I'm sitting with a couple, I'm thinking about their dynamics as both the music and the lyrics. So the lyrics, is the topic, the what of what they're having conflict about. And that tends to be kind of the whatever big four or five: parenting, in-laws, money, sex, domestic labor. I guess that's five, big five. Those are the topics, right? Where smart minds differ, things feel unfair. There's just sort of a daily grind to it. So that's the lyrics. But then the music is really where the action lies, right? Of understanding what are the patterns, what are the cycles, what are the dynamics, because in that way, it doesn't really matter what the topic is. There are still questions around, do you see me? Is my perspective valid? Do you respect who I am as a person? Do you have my back? Like those are kind of the form, like the form or the music behind the fight. And so that's so much of couples work, right? Is taking the fight of the week or the conflict of the week and really like understanding the anatomy of it and getting to what is beneath this argument about the toilet paper or about, your mother.
I agree with you that it feels like when we're talking about things non-related to sex, when there are people coming for sex therapy, we're talking about the same themes and same stories. Then I know in your book you talk about it. It's connected to our childhood stories and templates around
Mm,
kind of what love's supposed to look like, what relationship look like. So I think it's really powerful when you invite the readers to kind of look into their kind of recognizing and naming the stories, because
mhm.
sometimes people feel like that was in the past and I want to kind of like look at it. But somehow it shows up in our intimate relationship inside the bedroom. And I think one of the challenges that people have is difficult to talk about, kind of like their sexual needs, what's happening, and part of it is just they don't feel comfortable with their partner. And I know that one of the topics you talk a lot about is on the relational kind of self awareness, relational safety. So, how can we cultivate that in our relationship?
Right. Well, I'm really curious your thoughts on this as well because I mean, where the heck are any of us supposed to have learned how to talk about sex with our partners, right? That was not part of my sex education, was not part of my teenagers' sex education. It just really isn't. It's not something that we learn. And then even if we have some relationship role models, some of us are lucky enough to have elders in our family or family friends that we, grew up being able to observe when we were children that maybe serve as our relationship role models and they kind of model for us patience, respect, kind of mutuality. They probably were not our role models in terms of how we hopefully don't have any clue how they talk about their erotic life together, right? So we come into our adult intimate relationships without very much skill or savvy at all about talking about sex, even though the research shows that couples who can talk about sex end up having the best sex. And communication is essential, right? Because by what means would I possibly know what you want or how you want it or what's feeling good to you? And so I feel like I spend a lot of time giving couples permission to just Well, first of all, normalize and validate that talking about sex for lots of couples can be challenging. So when something is hard for us in our relationships or our marriages, we start to think something's wrong with us. We get pretty confused pretty quickly between it's hard versus we're broken or we're wrong or something's wrong with one of us. So the first thing I do is normalize and validate that sex is difficult to talk about. And then I really want couples to have a ton of permission about how they have those conversations, right? The little baby, what's the little baby edge of the conversation, and what format might you use to kind of help your walls come down? Might it be email? Might it be little notes back and forth? Might I met a couple one time that uses puppets to talk about sex. So they added this element of play to kind of disarm them, right? And so that's I am here for couples by any means necessary, creating a process for which they can talk about something that can be vulnerable. And it's vulnerable because we are self-conscious perhaps about what we want, and it's vulnerable because we don't wanna hurt our partner. We don't want our partner to feel hopefully, we don't want our partner to feel criticized or belittled, by us.
So many great points, and I love the puppet idea. And I think like one of the important piece is to have relational safety, right? Kind of
Mm,
feeling that okay, I feel safe enough in my relationship. Because if outside the bedroom we're constantly criticizing each other, like stonewalling, we haven't seemed like haven't cultivated that environment overall in the relationship. So as you mentioned, talking about sex is so much harder because it's taboo. We don't have the template. So if we have those challenges, it will be more difficult for us to even have these conversations.
mhm,
And I think one of the important thing for people to keep in mind is whatever you're into, there's nothing wrong with that. There's a
mhm,
galaxy of different preferences, different behaviors that people find sexy. And I think it's important to talk about it as an invitation because sometimes people are scared
mm.
that if my partner brings this, now I must do that. So that gets in the way of people being really showing up to talking about these things with our
Mm.
partners.
Yeah, those are really wonderful points. And it's also, as you're saying that, it's a reminder that if and when our partner gives us a little window into what they want, what they're longing for, to just hold that as sacred. I think I see this oftentimes. I'm going to do a little gender generalization, but I think sometimes, especially women who are partnered with men, based on their own stuff, perhaps if a male partner kind of opens up about something, even if it's something vulnerable about their erections or about, kind of the changes in their own bodies, I think sometimes it can be hard for female partners to really hold that, but just to know that it's and some, a partner may whatever, giggle or kind of diminish it or dismiss it because of their own discomfort. And so as you were talking about our preferences being this galaxy, and an ask being an invitation, not a demand, I think it's also if our partner is going to take a risk and share something with us, can we be can we ground ourselves? Can we just take a deep breath and kind of hold that with some sacredness, even if it creates some discomfort, some tension, some nervousness, some embarrassment inside of us? Like just knowing that a sexual share is probably the most vulnerable share, or potentially the most vulnerable share of them all. And so if our partner is going to do that, share something, to really like regulate ourselves so that we can receive it and hear it and hold it, and work with it.
Such a wonderful point. And sometimes because people are like holding on to this information for so long and it's connected with them also feeling shameful, sometimes we
Mm,
bring it up at odd times. Times that might not be
mm,
ideal or our partner might not have the openness in that moment to receive it. And as a result, intentionally people might experience a rupture. So if we experienced that rupture in the past, like maybe we had a share and our partner got reactive or they got defensive or dismissive, how do you invite people to do the repair? Is even the repair possible?
oof. It's a great question. Right. I mean, the number of times in my life that I've handled a difficult moment exactly the right way in real time, it's a pretty small number. I frequently ask for redos and do-overs, with my kids and with my husband. So I'm here. I am here for relational do-overs. And that is part, all of my work is about relational self-awareness, really noticing and taking responsibility for our own responses. And that does not mean we have to get stuff right the first time because as we're saying, we have our own history, especially around sexuality, that might lead us to be reactive or dismissive or embarrassed, da, 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 da. So we don't have to get it right the first time, but we do have to develop the capacity to notice that our response doesn't fit with who we want to be as a partner, doesn't fit with our mutual goal for relational safety. So then, can we be humble enough and brave enough to say, "Can I have a redo? Can I have a redo?" I was thinking about our conversation and you shared something that maybe was hard for you to share and maybe you waited a really long time to share it and maybe it was not the opportune time because I was up to my elbows in dishes or emails or whatever. But that doesn't take away from the fact that I want to have responded differently and better. So I'd like to have a do-over. I think that's a great way. I mean, I think ideally a repair happens because I recognize that I didn't show up the way that I wanted to. It can be a bit harder if you come back to me and you're like, "Hey, Alexandra, I shared a vulnerable thing with you. You got reactive or you shut me down, and now I feel hurt." But if it goes that way, then again, can I be humble enough and brave enough to say, "Okay, Dr. Nazanin, all right, try me again. I want to do it. I want to see if I can do right by you this time." So a repair can be initiated by either the person who did harm or the person who was harmed, right? There's two avenues into repair. But the person who did harm, through a dismissive response or a reactive response, the person who did harm is not a bad person, right? It's not about the quality of who you are as a person. It's about the chance that you missed an opportunity to help your partner feel safe. And because you value that and your partner values it, can you be brave enough to try a repair?
Beautiful. I love all you said in that sentence, and I think that's really important to know that everyone at times makes mistake.
Mm.
And I think one of the also important thing you mentioned is kind of like reflecting on what kind of a person you want to be. Like what are some of the what are the relational values that you have?
Mm.
Kind of going back to the family of origin things. I remember in my family that like whenever my dad was bringing up things to my mom was a master of kind of like bringing up like, but you did this the other time. And she's a writer and she has great language ability. So, and early on in my marriage, I felt like I can play that game. I'm really
Ooh.
good on talking about telling the stories. But is it going to help us to feel connected? And how do I feel about it? Right. Like, I feel like doing my going through my own therapy and through my work, I know, like, at times I have awareness that this is not helpful, but I think it's important to keep ourselves honest. So it's kind of like, okay, is that aligned with who I want to be or not? And then if not, then maybe I can ask for a redo. And I think it's so important, as you mentioned. Don't think about like you're a bad person, like, but you're taking accountability because you want to have a certain kind of relationship.
Yep. Yep. Very well said.
The other thing that you brought up that was fantastic was around our insecurities. And I think it's really connected to our how are we showing up sexually. Many people are kind of like playing it quote unquote safe because they just don't want to do something that's novel or new and feels vulnerable because they feel insecure in their bodies. How do you recommend people to kind of like cultivate more confidence?
Oh, I think this is I think this is a really incredibly tender issue. And I think i- my goal for all couples is that they get to play together. They get to express together sexually. They get to try new things together sexually because they take themselves lightly, right? There's so many of us, I think, no matter our gender, so many of us have very serious, heavy relationships with our bodies. We're really critical of our bodies, where our curves are, where our curves aren't, the size of things, the shape of things, the firmness or softness of things. So many of us have this ongoing, highly critical narrative about our bodies. And our bodies are precisely the place where erotic play happens, right? And so one of the things that can really hold us back is I'm scared to try that, not necessarily even because of how it feels, but because of how I might look, trying that or how my partner might see me. That Masters and Johnson called spectatoring, right? Like sort of leaving our bodies and looking at it from above. And so what I love is when couples can together just kind of name that, just put it out there that we don't look like the people in pornography or the people in romantic comedies, the people in we don't look like that. But in some ways, thank goodness we don't, because we get to look like us and we get to have this experience together. So I think that's what to me, confidence, sexual confidence, it's not about how you perform or how you look when you're doing something. It comes from a deep, deep well of self compassion and like relational compassion mixed in with a healthy dose of humor.
So important to kind of be playful, because sometimes we kind of like think about sex needs to look certain way, and if we're kind of straying away from that script, then there's something wrong with us or with our partner, or we're not doing it right. But then what I'm hearing that you're talking about more of an embodiment, kind of like paying attention on what shows up for you and how does it feel, and how are you guys like this? How are you guys connecting erotically? That's really important. And you know what's interesting? I work with lots of cisgender heterosexual couples, and sometimes I know people give feedback about their partner's body that can be very painful. And I think that also would be in place for people to kind of like ask for a redo. So I think that's also a really important conversation. One thing I love that you do in your page, which is very powerful, you give people tools and strategies to talk about things that are very difficult. If there's something in our partner that we don't like and we want to ask for a change, what would be a good way of bringing that up?
Hmm. Boy, this part about criticizing our partner's bodies is so, I mean, I hate that I have to keep doing and you have to keep doing education about this, but you want to shut somebody down sexually? You want to like tank your sexual relationship? Criticize your partner's body, right? Like that's for our cis hetero couples. I think if somebody has lived all their lives as a man, I don't they cannot, there's no way they can fully comprehend just what it's like to have been raised as a girl and a woman, and how much the culture objectifies us and how much we then go on to objectify ourselves. And so if he makes a comment about whatever it is, you've gained a little weight or what about working out more, it is like it can be, I'm not speaking for all women, but it can be just to the bone, and is going to have the effect of shutting her down because it is just a reflection of what she's saying to herself all the time anyways. So whenever we have a criticism about our partner's body, that is a massive invitation for us to look at what's going on inside of ourselves. Why? What is threatening to me about my partner's changing body? What is the narrative inside of me about the kind of body I'm entitled to? Or might I benefit from deconstructing or reimagining sexual attraction? Why is sexual attraction based on how many pounds on the scale you weigh versus how your body feels wrapped up with my body, right? So, a criticism about our partner's body is, in the vast majority of situations, an invitation to look at ourselves. What's going on inside of us that we are directing our attention out there. Now, certainly if our partner is grossly neglecting their body and it is impairing their health, that's a different kind of conversation. But as you're mentioning, these in our straight couples, there can just be, and I think women to men too. Women, I think traditionally part of what it is to be a woman is to tend to your male partner, to feed him, to make some women I know make their husband's doctor's appointments or kind of manage their care. It's like part of that caregiver role for women. And so it's a very thin line or a slippery slope from I'm in charge of making sure you are healthy to then I get to comment on when you are gaining a little bit of weight or when you are not working out enough. And I think that it might be easy for a woman to underestimate the power of her critique of her husband's body. So just, yeah, I think I'm so glad that you brought that up because I think we don't talk about that nearly enough about how our feelings about our partner's bodies say a lot more about us than they do about what's going on with our partner.
I agree with you, and I think those feedback can create a major rupture in the relationship, because you're right that it's this vulnerability for many cisgender women growing up in a diet culture constantly, and I feel it's even courageous to step into your erotic self when you're different than what's quote unquote considered sexy. So when people make those comments, then that can really create a rupture. And I think that's very helpful to keep in mind. And if your goal is to have more sexual experiences that are connecting, that conversation might do the opposite of it. And I love that you brought up that it's an indicator for you to think about what is happening and what are you going what journey you're going in, and what's the stories that you're showing up for you around sex and certain kind of body and certain kind of partners. So I think those were all excellent points. I have a lot of questions, but I know you talk a lot about a lot of these things on your show and your content. So if people are interested to learn more about you, what are some of the places that they can go to?
Mm. Well, the easiest place to get to know me and my work better is my website, which is just dralexandrasolomon.com. And when you get there, you will see a blog with hundreds of articles, and you can kind of play around on the blog. Another really great way to get to know me is my podcast that you mentioned before, Reimagining Love, which is a weekly show. And half the time I have guests on and we're in conversation about a variety of relationship topics. And half the time I'm creating solo episodes that are just me, kind of talking through a topic, whether it's, I love you, but I'm not in love with you. What does it mean if you say right person, wrong time? A relational conversation about jealousy. Like we cover a lot of different kind of relational conundrums in those solo episodes. And then I'm also active on social media. So on Instagram at dr.alexandra.solomon. Oh, and I have books. Books, and yes, I have two books, Reimagining Love and Taking Sexy Back, a third book coming out a few months down the road, and e-courses. There's lots.
Awesome, awesome. Well, I follow your Instagram. I read your book. I think they're all are great, great resources. So I invite our listeners to go ahead and check them out, and I'm sure they're going to get tons of great information from all of these wonderful ways that you share this information with others. Dr. Alexandra, thank you so much for coming in the show. This was certainly a treat.